literally the worst possible state for a geographical region to be in, and why that is unlikely to get better under any other circumstance and in any proximity of time. The second thing that we'll prove to you is why this will be the most effective alternative in terms of what strategy we need to pursue to get in terms of the best interests of the Kashmiri individuals. Recognize that this debate has to be judged from the lens of what is best from the interest of individuals, which means regardless of any other sort of benefit that is provided, if the marginal benefit to Kashmiri individuals is significant comparatively higher, we will win this debate. But lastly, we will show you why, even in the absolute worst case scenario, if like providing arms fails, which means like they lose the war or they're still overpowered, we will prove to you why that number one cannot be worse than the status quo, but number two will have marginal benefits that will be significantly empowering for Kashmiri individuals. But first, let's talk about the status quo, right? Let's talk about the state of Kashmir. First off, recognize that there is a overall media blackout, which means the only information that you get are at best extremely marginal, which means you have zero clue and like about the true picture of Kashmir right now. But what we do know is that the situation is extremely bad, which is to say people are being dragged out of their homes, people are getting homeless, people like the political discussions are being banned, political individuals are being disbarred, which means the people who are responsible for carrying out people's mandates are taken away, which means any sort of empowerment that the people had is taken away. But recognize that the government policy recognize the previous state of Kashmir, which was, by the way, the best state that it had in years, which is to say it had a government, it had a proper functioning policy, or so we thought. Even that government had to be extremely mindful of whatever they did of the Indian armed forces within that proximity, which is to say every policy had to be significantly nurtured to make sure that they did not piss anyone else off, which means the autonomy, which is the absolute best case, was at best tokenistic given the situation in right now, which is to say the next piece of analysis is why is it unlikely to get better? Because recognize who is leading this. This is being led by the Modi government, who, by the way, in his first term failed to keep the promise of giving people economic marginal benefits, which is to say, because he failed in his first term to deliver his promises, and because he won this election on the basis of giving people a better India in terms of like reuniting people and reuniting all its regions, he has to live through his promise to get any chance of being remembered as a good prime minister, right? Which is to say, he has to make sure that he does this. Which is to say, if any sort of persuasion is likely to fail because the Modi government is an asshole and will continue to do this regardless of whatever you do. But second, recognize that the allies who are trying to persuade India are significantly less powerful than India, which means the only two entities who have any sort of chance of getting anything through are India, China, and Pakistan. And these are the only two actors that we want to mobilize. The next part of my speech will talk about why this is likely to be effective. First off, look at the trend analysis regarding the Kashmiri forces. They were always the most strategic actor within that geographical region, which is to say, they had a strategy of letting live and let live, which is to say, they were extremely strategic in terms of what they pursued, in terms of what they did, which is to say, the Indian armed forces did not actively bombard them or like destroy their places. They were extremely strategic in how they dealt with it, which is to say, given that we will spread arms to them, the war is likely to be extremely strategic, which is to say there will not be any aimless firing or random killings, but it will be extremely strategic in nature. But why? What prevented them from being effective all these years? The only problem was that the Kashmiri armed forces or the separatist movements were extremely weak in nature, which gave the Indian government the ability to convince its individuals that, look, even if we invade Kashmir, there's no losses that we are particularly getting, which means that the Indian people were not particularly being killed or India were not suffering significant losses by engaging in that war. The moment in time you empower them, number one, you give them the ability to execute their strategies even better. But second, you give the ability for the Indian people for the first time ever to suffer some degree of losses for intervening in Kashmir, which means this is analogous to what happened like in Iraq regarding America. The American people were pissed off because of the fact that the people, like American soldiers, were being killed in Iraq, which is to say, even if the worst case scenario is that radicals will be even more pissed because more lives are being lost or that Indian soldiers are being killed, what more can they possibly do, right? Like, right now, there could possibly be a genocide in Kashmir and you still have zero clue about what's happening because that's how clueless and that's how bad the situation is. Which is to say, even if people become more hardline as a result of this, there's unlikely to happen. But second, the marginal benefit from the situation is, for the first time ever, there is some degree of opportunity to make the Indian government sit and discuss and have a cost-benefit analysis as to how much are we losing, how much ability do we have of getting into war. Through all of that phases, we think Kashmiri individuals can have a significant significantly better life. So in terms of the Kashmiri individuals, we would rather have a world where we at least have some degree of opportunity to get people think about our situation, which hasn't been happening for so long. Before I move on to the worst case scenario comparison, I'll take closing.
Do you really believe that a better armed guerrilla strategy warfare will allow you to take the might of the Indian power?
Yeah, literally, because for the first time ever, you have the ability to pose some degree of threat to the Modi government, because recognize that the Modi government is already telling you that Pakistan is a terrorist threat. The Modi government already tells you a lot of other things, so nothing else is working right now. That was the first part of my speech, right? But the last part, even if it fails, the most important benefit is that for most separatist movements work like this. They first target on the most vulnerable groups within the region in order to galvanize support, because they want to be the people's favorite, or they want to be the flag bearers of hope within that region, which means a marginal benefit for the most vulnerable Kashmiris, the people whose houses are being burnt off or have nowhere to live or are dying from starvation. They will be the ones who are driven off the border and have some degree of hope for the first time. This is the only sort of marginal benefit that any side can provide you, which means the impact of this is that the most vulnerables are safe. But second, mitigates the amount of harm that the Indian armed forces, even in the worst case of battle, even if they lose, can have, which means this delays the attack, this gives them greater degree of self-defense, but most importantly, this at least creates some degree of deterrence, which means right now, you can't go in and brush fire everyone, because you know that some people there can have strategic wars given by China and Pakistan. That deterrence in and of itself is a marginal benefit. Why do we win this debate? Because one, we've shown you that the state of Kashmir is in an absolute state of no other alternative, which means this is the only situation you have of getting anything better. But second, we've shown you a trend analysis which shows you why Kashmiri forces can be strategic. If empowered, they can actually be effective. But lastly, we've shown you the mechanism that even if all else fails, why this will still lead to marginal benefits for Kashmiri people. So for the sake of Kashmiri people, stand with open government.
Yeah.
And also close the door if the last person's in. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you for the speech, inviting the leader of opposition.
I'd like to show a distinction between Kashmiri separatists and the broader Kashmiri civilian population. Don't get me wrong, they've suffered a lot, and they've suffered for close to half a century, if not more. And yet, that does not necessarily mean that the end goal is an independent Kashmir or a segregated Kashmir. Perhaps it's simply one piece, perhaps it's simply one economic opportunity. In many instances, all they want is for the Indian government to stop discriminating against them. So that's the first distinction I'd like to draw. The second distinction I'd like to draw is the idea that if there were any separatist intentions on the part of a significant part of the Kashmiri population, those intentions have already existed 50 years before. And it's played out war after border war, conflict after conflict, insurgency after insurgency with no results. I think many of the Kashmiri people are tired, and all they want is a solution to this conflict that doesn't require you to fight a civil war, a proxy war for decades to come. In fact, in this half century of conflict, there were pockets of relative peace. Not great. Discrimination by the Indian government was still rife, don't get me wrong. But it was much better than the alternative where Pakistan has, in the last 50 to 70 years, actively supported these separatist groups anyway, and we've seen no outcome. You are basically replaying the same fucking game plan and thinking you're going to make a difference. And I think, last but not least, with regard to what Kashmiris actually want, doesn't cohere with that characterization. They're not all Muslim. Quite a individuals probably don't want to see Kashmir descend into another civil war, become an independent Muslim state, or as part of their sovereign territory. So quite clearly, the picture is quite mixed. No, thank you. But I've got three things I want to talk about as a result. The first of which is that you've got no endgame. The second of which is that the endgame looks really, really bad for you. And last but not least, what our endgame looks like. So let's explain why there is no endgame on your side. And I think the POI about how you can't beat the Indian army actually rings true. How do you evaluate this, right? You've got two factors. You've got capability as well as motivation. So let's look at capability first. Obviously, we know that the Indian army is massive. It is relatively well trained, given the fact that it's fought in border war after border war, and as poor a country as like India can be, it spends a hell of a lot on its military. It's pretty advanced, like technologically, it is disciplined, it is well led. And that's the reason why it's fought multiple border wars with China and Pakistan in the past, and they've done fine. The question therefore is, like, is Pakistan able to influence events in Kashmir to the extent that they can dislodge the Indian army and the hundreds of thousands of troops that might already be there? Pakistan has less economic might, right? Smaller population, right? Its army may be powerful, that's true, but in a long drawn-out war with India, or even if it's a proxy war that involves you supplying other actors, you are more likely to run out of resources than they do. And of course, the question therefore is China. But I'll get to that in a bit, right? The reality is that Pakistan has already been directly involved in Kashmir. Even China has been involved in Kashmir in the 1960s, but we don't see India giving up its claims or being forced to cede like significant territories anytime soon. So let's talk about motivation then, right? Will China risk a border war that it has not fought with India for 50 years for part of Kashmir or to aid Pakistan? No, because Kashmir is not essential to Pakistan's national interest, like even though it's useful, and that means that Pakistan is not going to collapse anytime soon if they don't have Kashmir, which means that the utility of having Pakistan as an ally to counter India will still be there, and therefore there's no marginal benefit for China to intervene significantly. They will provide resources, sure, but it stops there. And as for Pakistan, will Pakistan be able to wear India out? No, India is not like the United States. You're not going to get an Iraq war scenario because nationalism is much higher. Like the history of conflicts is just a lot greater. So they are sworn enemies rather than an opportunistic enemy in the form of Iraq. And most importantly, India's army, as massive as it is relative to its population size, is small. The amount of war weariness that you can realistically generate to force into India to the negotiating table is nil. And if I buy the Prime Minister's analysis, it becomes even worse. A genocide can happen in Kashmir and you wouldn't know it. Fucking right you are. That's what happens when you have a media blackout. That means you don't have an anti-war movement that happens in India as a result because not enough is being known by the citizens to suggest that, oh no, the Indian army is not actually the side that you want to support. And so the end game, therefore, is one in which you have hundreds of thousands of well-trained like Indian army troops, like patrolling the streets, conducting like operations against like various separatist groups in the mountains or what have you, and all that leads to is a situation in which you cannot dislodge the Indian army because there's too many of them and they're willing to die, or they're expendable in the eyes of the Indian military. And on the other side, the Indian army can't dislodge the separatists because, sure, you flush them out of the major cities, but they are separatist groups, they hide in the mountains where you can't reach them. You're going to have a protracted civil war. What happens? Random terrorist attacks. Thousands of people die. Like no foreign investment or any investment of any sort comes in precisely because the situation is so unstable that nobody is willing to build factories and send their workers there. You've got many separatists that eventually wreak havoc on civilian populations. And the worst part is there's the possibility that Indian government themselves may choose to arm their own like versions of separatists or their own groups in the vicinity as well. That creates huge problems as well. You've got no end game. That's the worst case scenario. I'll talk about the best case scenario in a bit, the fantasy scenario that I think about at night. But yeah.
So the constitutional changes allows non-Kashmiris to buy land and property and live within Kashmir. Why would there be even a Kashmir in your world?
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that. I think the situation is pretty shit, but I think yours is worse, right? So best case scenario, you create an independent Muslim Kashmir, right? So here's the problem, right? Two things. First, India can play the same game as well. Right? And that means that if let's say Kashmir becomes independent, or parts of Kashmir become independent, India will do a Pakistan, sponsor terrorist groups, sponsor separatist groups, because like there will still be Hindus like interspersed with the Muslim population. That's a rife population that you can exploit. The second thing is, are you sure that governance in the region is going to be better, even if you solve the discriminatory laws with regard to land ownership on your side? No. Because Pakistan's track record of governing regions, or the Kashmir's track records of governing this particular region, is bad given the relative lack of investment, given the fact that it's hard to exert central authority in these areas because of like terrorist groups or because it's so far away from the capital. And even if that independent Kashmir was separate from Pakistan, we're going to run into a lot of problems because Pakistan's track record of not sponsoring terrorist groups in neighboring countries is pretty shit. You see Afghanistan and many of the terrorist groups that Pakistan has sponsored, oh no, they're aligned to Pakistan. Afghanistan isn't like India, but no, nothing happens precisely because the same problems with the ISI appear. What then is your endgame? Your best strategy is not to play. Your best strategy is not to win. No matter how bad like land ownership laws can be in India, at the very least, you'll be able to have relative peace and stability. At the very least, we'll have some semblance of economic development. At the very least, you have a chance for Indian statehood, at the worst case scenario, or a reinstatement of Article 370 in the best case scenario. And those options are far better than whatever you can come up with on your side for those reasons we're opening up.
All right, thank you very much. Inviting the next speaker, Dr. Carlos.
Three, two, one. Always wanted to win a out round from OG. Finally, that's going to happen today because entire speech from Adil, right, has absolutely no mechanism in what they're trying to achieve today. Because like in the 8th minute, he comes up and tells like two mechanisms of what they want, but eventually he never tells us how it is they're going to achieve a Kashmir that eventually gets to be a part of India to begin with, in a state, in a way that is not scuppered, in a way that is actually going to result in Kashmiris being actual Kashmiris and people who are not locked up like poultry. But before we move on to anything, I'm going to tell you 4 reasons alternatives don't work, because I assume that's what CEO is going to do too, and try to prove to you that there will be some alternative that works. After that, I'll explain why things will actually work in general. And lastly, we're going to explain to you why the autonomy in general is the end goal. But understand this, no gov will ever be able to prove to you, ever, that Pakistan or China is going to win this war. Therefore, that is not the burden on any gov so far. Which is to say, the burden that is on gov is to say the marginal improvement in the lives of the Kashmiri citizens. Therefore, 3 or 4 minutes of Adil's speech proving us a war will not won is pointless. No one has to defend that, right? All right, now first, why the alternatives don't work? 1, waiting for Indian people to get back their conscience and fight for us. That won't work. Why? Because the government has a terrible economic situation right now. It got to power on the basis of promoting the ideologues that it will save and unify India. Therefore, the hardliners are the only way it will get to power in general. It came here on the pretext that Kashmir is going to be the policy platform that will unify Kashmir. Which is to say, they will never back down from Kashmir if they don't see a loss there. Which is to say, if you tell us that thousands of people will die because Indian separatists will come there, or Indian government will start wreaking havoc, that's already happening. Because what will Indian government say more? That there are more separatists. That's not a marginal improvement or more angry for the Indian people. Because understand, the Indian people already came here because they felt as if the hardliners, as if the separatists already exist, and therefore that's not negative. Understand, these hardliners are people who the Indian government needs support from. Therefore, they're always going to play for that hardliners. Second, Kashmir is getting independence in some way possible, right? For example, maybe the separatists get independence in the same way right now, without any sort of support. That's never going to happen. They're under the Special Forces Act. All popular leaders have been rounded up. The politicians have absolutely no say. They have no power, etc. Third, international pressure. Pakistan, China, and US put them under pressure. Pressure for years. Pakistan has been scampering about and shouting out for a long time, ever since Indian government did something like that. Did anything happen? No. Therefore, we saw no reason as to how some benefit will come out from this. Lastly, this is the best goal, right? Kashmiris will integrate back into India. 3 things. 1, you will lose the autonomy that you enjoyed for so long. The 35A that was inside the constitution has been gone. That is the reason why this is continuing. Therefore, Kashmiris will lose all autonomy to hold a general election. Therefore, they become a minuscule part of India, a part of India that hates them, a part of a country that hates them. Which is to say, they will no longer enjoy any sort of autonomy. They will go worse than Bihar enjoyment. And trust me, I know that Bihar is in a horrible position because I hail from there. But secondly, understand, India has a policy of destroying the homogeneity of Kashmiri culture, which is to say, you allow the Indians to buy home. That POI was important, and this is why it's important. Because understand, the Kashmiris value this more than their lives, which is to say, in general, if these people are able to buy homes to the point where they're able to eradicate the very Kashmiri culture, then these people have nothing benefiting them by staying inside India. Therefore, your entire best policy from all to try and this culture and homogeneity does not work because it doesn't allow them to do anything positive. Therefore, the end goal for Kashmiri people, and understand, this might be a weird value, this is Kashmiri value, that they want their homogeneous culture to exist. If that is true, then you must value this in this debate, because this debate is about the interest of the Kashmiri people and what they value. You don't get to impose your universal beliefs upon them. Now, why will this work? Okay, you don't have to beat the Indian army danger. What you have to do is make sure that Indians feel a sense of loss. Why is this important? Because one, before even proving the sense of loss, one, it's important that the separatists are able to smuggle people across the border into Pakistan area so that the people don't die. There is an absolute benefit. You will always have more. Why do we believe this will work? Because for so far, the Pakistanis and the Kashmiri separatists, Pakistani Kashmiris have a very good working relationship, which is to say they are able to smuggle weapons and smuggle people all across the border for a long time, even though India has a lot more clamped down pressure on them now, which is to say they already have a policy of getting people across the border. This will continue working and will do better now, primarily because this has happened for so many years. So even if the Indians are clamping down now, they will be able to do it now. Why is this something that can win the debate on its own? Because no side can prove things because it's a probabilistic outcome on either side. This might work, that might work. Here, it's an absolute positive outcome, where at least 10 people might be saved because it can smuggle them across the border. For probabilistic outcomes to occur, everyone needs to see that something might happen. Here, it will definitely happen because we've seen it happen for so long. Therefore, making and arming these people by allowing them to provide cover and fighting the Indian army, holding them off, providing necessary hours and minutes that the people can escape from is an absolute value that you must champion in this debate, because there's an absolute debate winning argument. But second, here's the important part, because understand, what do they have to do? They have to prove to the Indians that there's a sense of loss here. Indian hardliners will say that, look, our Indian soldiers are dying, but the Naujawans that are dying because you now allowing them to lose. Right now, you are equating fighting and having some sort of economic loss because you're pouring money into Kashmir versus a sense of Indian pride. Now you're equating the lives of your Naujawans and the lives of flimsy benefit of regional pride in India. Is that an equation that Indian mothers and fathers will be willing to accept, ladies and gentlemen? Consider the hardliners are usually the ones that go into the army to begin with. Therefore, it's their sons that are going to die in Indian Kashmir when the separatists fight. Therefore, even if 1,000 separatists die, ladies and gentlemen, it's still better if they kill the 10 Indian soldiers, because it proves to these Indians that something might happen. There's something bad will happen. But understand, here's why the genocidal idea was important, right? Because the genocide idea is true under both cases. You still have a media blackout. What negative argument are you going to propose to us that will actually let this happen, right? Because understand, the op in this debate is very difficult to do. Why is that? Because there's no marginal harm that you can prove at all. Sir, Lord.
Your Prime Minister said that Modi is a nationalist. Wouldn't that mean that this will be from NFP campaign?
Yes, he's a nationalist. He will use this as a front to increase his campaigns. And he's already using the pretext of separatists as the reason for sending these people in. What marginal harm are you already creating, right? Because understand, Modi's support is an all-time high, even though the economy is in tatters, because he's used this pretext, right? People in India already believe the Indian soldiers are being killed by separatists, even though the amount is already at its all-time low before the Indian soldiers are sent in. Which is to say, your best-case scenario of Indians getting pissed off is a truth in current world. It's the status quo. The status quo already has Indians pissed off, wanting to screw these people off, ladies and gentlemen. We already proved to you why the autonomy is bad. Now, what can possibly happen out of this, ladies and gentlemen? Possible end result is that Indian government realizes it's not worth the investment of getting Kashmir into its fold, because understand that is not good enough. We eventually make these people realize the cost-benefit analysis is not good enough. Therefore, what's the probabilistically most likely outcome? That they give them back the autonomy because Kashmir is just not important enough for them. Therefore, you get a marginal increase in autonomy and you don't allow the Indian government to play with Kashmir anytime it likes. Because the best case scenario from opposition is that the Indian government is generous enough to give us the back. But understand, the Indian government was generous enough to give us that by having us under the Special Forces Act, where people get abducted from your home at any point of time. That is what Indian mercy gets to, ladies and gentlemen. We would want a liberal government and we would want fancy words to win this debate. It does not. These are desperate times requiring desperate measures. Thank you so much.
The audience coming in, quickly come in and close the door as well. Thank you. Right, thank you for the speech, inviting the Leader of Opposition.
I think OG lost the debate the moment they said that we must do this because India must feel the loss. Given that this debate rests on trying to protect the Kashmiri people who are the most important, why are you risking the lives of thousands of soldiers and fucking civilians for the sake of fucking vengeance and spite just to stick it to a country? I don't understand why we must allow countries like India, Pakistan, and China to fight a proxy war, which at the end of the day worsens the precise lives of the people that you are trying to protect. The second reason why this also loses them the debate is because by their own characterization, they tell us that BJP is extremely nationalistic and that Modi is an asshole, as they say verbatim in Prime Minister. This also means, at worst, it means BJP is never going to give up, because if it's an issue of pride, be rest assured they're going to fight to the death. This therefore implies that OG has no actual endgame, because they also again admit that this is not about winning the war, but yet at the same time they want India to give up a country which has ridiculous amounts of military might versus separatists. That is the war that we are fighting, and they are not actually calculating the consequences of the war that they want to wage on opening government. I think closing government has to really deal with this. I'm going to talk about two things in this debate. One, is arming the separatists necessarily reliable as an option in Kashmir? And secondly, how do we get to the end game on both sides of the house? One, is arming the separatists reliable as an option in Kashmir? Here are the claims that we hear from government bench, right? They tell us that this strategy is important because, and they say there's no other option because there have been decades of fighting. They also tell us there's large amounts of media blackout. Here's the response. I think the last full conflict that actually happened in the state of Kashmir was 6 to 7 years ago. What was the genesis of this conflict? This was due to large separatist groups, either both backed by Pakistan and by India, engaging in large scale of civil war. The only way we were able to end this conflict in 2012 and 2013 is when both India and Pakistan did not engage in further violence, but instead decided to back down and pull out separatist groups on both sides of the house. This is also true because OG also admits that right before India removed parts of the constitution, Pakistan was a relatively more peaceful state than it was. This therefore implies that if we are going to try and arm separatists again, the likely outcome is that you're going to re-emerge, like the separatists are going to re-emerge from the state of like stasis that they have been for the past 6 to 7 years. What does OG then do, and why is this a bad thing? This leads to an extremely precarious situation where you're going to reawaken the bubbling conflict, both from an ideological perspective and from a military perspective. Why this is bad? This is bad because in terms of like the response that you're likely to accept from India, you're likely to provoke a strong, like violent response from the Indian government because they are also likely to back the separatist group in response to this. This therefore means that you're not actually saving the Kashmiri people, you're worsening their lives. Why is this likely to be true? Adil tells you, and they don't engage with this, that the interests of the Kashmiri people and the interests of the separatist groups are very, very different. The interest of the separatist group may be the best case version, which is to gain full autonomy, but given that we don't know whether the outcome is actually likely to happen in opening government, and given that we also tell you that this debate is about what the Kashmiri people want, I think Kashmiri people are more likely to accept a compromise where they don't get full autonomy, but at least there's more stability in the short run. This is why I think their model actually worsens those scenarios. What is India likely to do? They tell us that a blackout has happened. You know what's going to happen once separatist groups start arming themselves? India is going to crack down even harder on things such as having curfews, on like things such as like creating war conflict in different parts of the country, jailing more separatist groups, for example, in public statements saying that this is an unfair war that like Pakistan and China are waging against us. All of these methods mean and implies that the people who suffer the most at the end of the day are the Kashmiri people because they have no agency. The second reason why this claim is likely to be true is because the government is aiming the wrong group at this point in time, right? Given that you have a finite number of resources, we think it's far more important to try and help the Kashmiri people versus distributing that resources in government banks to the separatists whose aims may not even be entirely that to protect the Kashmiri people in the first place, but may just be that we just want independence at all costs. That's why it's also a problem when government says that we have no end game and we don't care about winning the war. Because notice in their DPM, they tell us that Indians want Kashmiri people want the autonomy back and the constitution back. But no, they're never going to get those articles back in unless you win the war as a Kashmiri person or you win the war for Kashmir. Therefore, this means by their own analysis, right, given that they have no end game, they also can't actually prove the outcome that they want. The next reason why they lose on basis of outcome is just because Prime Minister makes a very tenuous link that once you fund the separatist group, somehow magically India is going to pursue the route of diplomacy. They don't actually explain why India's response is more likely to pursue diplomacy versus violence. Me and others have given you a couple of structural reasons why violence is more likely the provocation from the Indian government as opposed to diplomacy, which we think is a more reliable solution if you really want to protect the people of Pakistan. Kashmir, sorry. No, thank you. What therefore is the impact of this, right? This claim. 3 things. One, their bench reignites ideological violence in Kashmir and creates far more violence. Secondly, their solution worsens lives for the Kashmiri people. Why do we think we take this sort of clash? We are saying that the Kashmiri people need to be protected at all costs. Secondly, getting to the end game, right? This is where they accuse us of not having a mechanism. But before that, sure, close.
What are you going to do?
Okay, yes. Okay, tell me. Okay. They tell us how we're going to get them. We think the most important thing for Kashmiri people to do is, one, we don't want any Pakistan intervention, we don't want any Indian intervention, we actually want to get discourse. Why is discussions more likely to happen even in this particular state? I think that diplomacy in terms of talks between both parties has, one, already been happening, that's true. Secondly, and more importantly, it also implies that the last time we were able to achieve some sort of stability was when both sides, India and Pakistan, recognized that arming separatist groups is not really the solution to Kashmir. The reason why this is likely to be true is, again, Kashmir is not a place full of Muslims, right? There are Indians and Muslims, and both Indian and Pakistani governments have some interest in protecting their own interests insofar as those people are Indian, also by Hindu and Muslim. This therefore means that at least trying to get them to the negotiating table is more likely to be an endgame that we are preferable with. This is because on their side of the house, given that they are waging a war where they say they don't want to win the war, how long are they going to continue their violence for, right? How long is the insurgency going to last? It's actually unclear on government bench, right? Because you don't actually want to win the war. If so, what the hell do you want to do? At least on our side of the house, the end game is clear for all parties. We want to try and stop this as far as possible. Here's the worst case on our side of the house. It may be true that the Kashmiri people will no longer have autonomy. It may be true that those articles can never be regained. But we tell you that Kashmir is not about a place, it's about the people. But the more serious response is that we think the comparative Kashmiri people have to accept is, at least on our side of the house, even if they never get full autonomy, if the violence stops, if both governments stop playing a proxy war in your very battleground, we think that's preferable to the alternative where you end up waging a war which affects all parties, which affects the Kashmiri people, and a war which does not give them any agency to sort of dictate what they want. This is because the terms of engagement, even assuming government's best case, is going to be between the separatist groups and the Indian and Pakistan government. Given that this debate is about the Pakistan Kashmiri people, who is going to represent them on government bench? I don't think government has the answers to any of these questions. I think this is a horrible model that we want to follow. I think people of Kashmir need to be protected. I'm very, very proud to oppose.
Yeah.
The open half, inviting for CG.
Opening government's case relied on two things. And insofar as I can take them down, sorry, not opening government, opening opposition, I am fairly confident they do not have a position in this debate. Number one, they made this link between they made this distinction between the interests of the average Kashmiri individual and that of, say, guerrillas, separatist movements, etc. I think they were able to get away with this because opening government did virtually very little to analyze what Kashmiri people have wanted for the longest time. But secondly, is that they also assume that insurgencies are not going to happen regardless. Yeah. They wanted a world where you have, quote unquote, relative peace. I am yet to understand what that world actually looks like. Because note that guerrilla movements, insurgencies are a natural response to things like military interventions, to things like military attack, police brutality, human rights violations, etc. So these things are likely to exist regardless. The debate now becomes, number one, under which world would you rather have it? One, where they are minimal in their power and ability to provide protection and dignity to the Kashmiri people? Or is it one where you are backed by two extremely powerful forces? Three things in my speech. Number one, I'll break this distinction and show you why politically they're very similar in nature, hence why Kashmiri individuals are likely to follow through with this. But furthermore, note that there are different outcomes in this debate that we have to analyze. Number one is, I will tell you how this leads to the possibility of India proposing the referendum that the Kashmiri individuals were denied a long time ago. But secondly, another impact is that it could possibly reverse Article 370 as a desperate move to consolidate whatever influence they have there, which is also good for Kashmiri people. But lastly, I'll analyze why the possibility of secession, if it ever comes to that, is actually good in this particular time. Let's see what Adil said. He said that Kashmiris and insurgency groups are different. Some individuals want economic empowerment and etc. Here's the thing, is that sure, that might have been true a couple years back, but this debate takes place right now. And the trend has shown that there is an increasing descent towards the Indian government. And there's an increasing sympathy for Pakistan-administered Kashmir. And there's a very clear-cut reason for this. Number one, the Pakistan-administered Kashmir, otherwise called Azad Kashmir, is doing fantastic in terms of protection, human rights, safeties, etc., right? And these are things that obviously across the border you can easily, tangibly recognize that, look, there are better lives objectively in that area. So practically many of them have come to the conclusion that our lives could be better off in that side of the world. Sure, there aren't many economic opportunities, but comparatively not being beaten for carrying a Pakistani flag, I think is far better for a lot of them. Secondly, note that these are the resentments that are shared within various different insurgent groups and people on the ground. Because you're forgetting that a lot of these insurgent groups are people that have become these insurgent groups as a direct result of it. Most groups, like for example, Hizbul Mujahideen, are college students. These are everyday average individuals that have taken up arms. Stone pelters are people who come from every walks of life. You have 11-year-old girls to like 25-year-old men to really, really old people that also comprise of these movements. Thirdly, note that separatist doesn't necessarily mean a guerrilla fighting group. It can also be political parties that are present within Kashmir. So first argument is that how this leads to the possibility of a referendum being granted. Note that Pakistan and China can do various different things. Number one, collectively with their economic strength, they can double down the funding that they have done before. Your job's not to come here and tell me that it has been futile in the past. This is about Pakistan and China collectively doing it together. I think being like having the economic powerhouse of the world on your side makes it a lot better in your effort. So number one, they can do various different things. They can fund political parties that are pro-separatism. And this exists in many areas of Kashmir. Number one, you have leaders like Umar Farooq that actively voice out against things like Indian occupation. Why is this something that Pakistan would want? Because the point in time in which, what can Pakistan do to make this true? Number one is that they can bring him to Security Council meetings, as they have done plenty of times in the past. They can actively shine light in a lot of these problems. In fact, Khan can actually bring these people to Islamabad and shine a greater light on their plight and their sufferings. What can come as a direct result of this? Number one, because it is internationally very unpopular for India in its current position, it's going to have to at some point want to give in to this referendum. Because note that the current trajectory in which India is going in is one that is extremely unsustainable. That Kashmir is not a Kashmir that India can hold on to in any meaningful way. So what does this referendum do, and why would Pakistan want it? Here's why Pakistan would want it. Because even if there's a possibility that Kashmir would want independence, it's still a win-win situation for Pakistan, even if they don't get that. Why is this true? Because an independent Kashmir acts as a buffer between Pakistan and India. And militarily speaking, that is an extremely good benefit for Pakistan, especially considering that India is far more powerful than it. But secondly, note that there's also a possibility that they might just go over to Pakistan. This was the referendum that they were supposed to be given under the UN order, forgot what year, 2007, 2008 or something like that, a long time ago, right? There are two significant possibilities in this, and under both situations, Pakistan is likely to win. And most importantly, as established earlier, this resonates with the large-scale majority in terms of what they want politically. But secondly, note that this might also reverse Article 370. Because look, they can come here and say India is not going to want to give this referendum. Hence, we are proposing various different reasonable alternatives that may happen. What could happen in this particular circumstance? Note that Article 370 is also important for Pakistan, because even though it is an Indian-administered Kashmir, it is also still a buffer between you and India, because it's a government that acts independently of what federal government in India wants. So what could India do as a desperate move to want to consolidate power in this region? India could India could just take away that particular article, or at least they could make it within their mandate. Now, I understand that this is politically unpopular. M will do it, I promise. I understand that this is politically unpopular for the current government, but here's the crucial nuance that you have to understand. It's a move of desperation. If it's not the referendum, Article 370 is the least that India can do in this particular circumstance, reversing the damages and bringing Kashmir back to the somewhat okay situation it wasn't. But thirdly, why the possibility of secession is great. And I don't think OG did enough of a job to analyze this in any significant extent. Because note here is that the military capabilities of both these countries is significant. China is part of this debate. They said China will never want to get involved. There's this region called Bhutan, and China has beaten the shit out of India in that region just because they could, right? There's very likely that they're going to want to engage in similar warfare, given that Aksai has been part of the CCP's mandate for a very long time. It is also largely uninhabited, so it's not politically unpopular for them to just station tanks wherever they want in that particular area. They've done the same in Bhutan. That's why they could succeed. Secondly, note that Pakistan could just double down the funding of these groups. The ISI has gotten to a point where they have more insurgent groups within their personal arsenal. You have groups from Afghanistan, you have groups all over the world, like in different parts of the country, like Balochistan, etc. They can easily just restructure these groups to be operating in that region. And they were fairly successful when they did this a long time ago, directly following the Afghan war, where they stationed the new Taliban in that particular region. That is how funding can significantly increase under this side. Look, this debate comes down to various different possibilities. It cannot just be secession, it cannot just be independence. We were the first team to acknowledge the various different circumstances that could result as a direct result of this funding. You could fund political groups and you could fund insurgencies. Both of them have preferable outcomes for the Kashmiri people. For all these reasons, CG takes this debate.
Great, thank you very much. Inviting the first speaker for CG.
So CG comes up and say that we're not only talking about military, but we're also talking about like political separatists, right? But at the same time, they also want protections from Indian military, right? So definitely they also support like Kashmiri's military, right? And what are the Kashmiri's military? This would be the exclusive contribution coming from CEO, in which we would say, and we will be able to only think that characterize what are these separatist terrorist groups, what are their characteristics, and why they will heighten conflict, and why there would be a tangible help on that side of the house if we support these particular groups, and they would definitely be supported, ladies and gentlemen. Second, we are also going to be the only team that talks about an exclusive alternative solutions, why negotiations can happen in the Article 230, and why we think that the results of those negotiations would still be in line with the cultural and economic interests of Kashmiris. So first of all, let's talk about like the separatist terrorist groups also engaging with that side of the house, right? So we think that it's very likely, because of like all of these limited capacities of Pakistan and China might be touched up from the opening opposition, that they would choose to operate on funding these groups, right? Let's characterize these groups. First, let's talk about most of them are not what they say. Okay, they might say that there are groups that are with children that are females and so on, but a lot of them are actually terrorist groups, ladies and gentlemen. What are we talking about? We're talking about Jais and Mohammed, for instance, which operations in 2016 alone have killed 25 soldiers in Indian nationality. We're talking about Lashkar-e-Taiba, in which in a very long protracted war have wounded thousands and have killed hundreds of Indian civilians, ladies and gentlemen, not even like military personnel. What's the consequence is this, ladies and gentlemen? We think that it's very vital for us to notice that these groups would be labeled as terrorist groups, and these groups would be labeled as human rights violators, ladies and gentlemen. This is exactly dealing with all of their characterizations are actually what makes India much more heightened in terms of engaging militarily with the Kashmiris, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Because they say that opening government says that there would be more cost analysis because we've heard more, we won't attack militarily anymore. But we think that in the same characterization of nationalism that have and Hindu nationalism that they have portrayed, like the killing of civilians and the killing of militaries, both are Indian nationalities and both are Hindus, are exactly the trick to make more military operations that are going to happen in Kashmir, ladies and gentlemen. There are several other consequences. Now, all of the negotiations that they want, because we still support terrorist groups, because these terrorist groups still exist, will be also easily framed by India as also a type of terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. They are associated with these terrorist groups anyway, ladies and gentlemen. The Kashmiris as a whole have a tarnished international reputation, and a tarnished reputation in general in terms of any kinds of other negotiations would be very hard on that side of the house. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we also think that international community like US then would also be forced to side with India in this particular case, or the United Nations, because they have already the consistent tenet in which they are against terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. So this is an important characterization on our side of the house. But furthermore, they talk about some engagements to CG, they talked about China can still help in this particular case, so the military would win anyway. the counter example would be very confusing because if we're talking about Bhutan, let's compare Bhutan and India, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that when you want to fight in India, most probably China would have to get a lot of weapons towards the Kashmir because they would have to get a lot of troops there, ladies and gentlemen. It's not something that they would do, ladies and gentlemen. It's not something that they can do like on an off time, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that in these particular cases, China have much crucial interest in terms of protecting South China Sea, for instance, which is very urgent right now. So if you think about the future, which is differentiating from obviously, talking about the past will do not help, they will help. We think that China and Pakistan will be very limited in terms of their help. But the most important consequence in this is we think that when we choose to fund these separatist groups, which automatically means also supporting terrorist groups, any chance for future negotiations would be, no thank you, would be very lost, ladies and gentlemen, because any kinds of the negotiations would be tarnished. So now let's talk about the negotiations, why they will happen and why we think that it's still in the interest of the Kashmiris. Let's first, deconstruct why Indians want to have Article 230, right? We think that the reasons actually practically only economical, and not as cultural and political as they might see. Because if the interest is actually to kill Kashmiris, for instance, or wipe out Kashmiris, or like to colonize Kashmir, ladies and gentlemen, fully, then they would already do it anyway, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's important characterization. Why is it something that is within Indian economic interest? No, thank you. And it's something that they actually want that much that they still have, lower bargaining position in terms of this. No, thank you. First of all, we would characterize that India actually have like 4.8 billion USD in debt, and they have like trade deficits until like 200 billion US dollars. The consequence of that, they actually really need a lot of cash right now. And where can those cash come from, ladies and gentlemen? No, thank you. Would be from having this article revoked. Why? Because it allows some of the land ownership to be also for Indians and not only exclusively for Kashmiris. Now, thank you. A lot of studies from experts have said that Kashmiris is very potential in land, not necessarily to wipe out the population, but there are a lot of lands that can be used for resources, can be used for industries, for instance, lands that can be used for hotels, and good views within beaches that can be used for tourism, ladies and gentlemen. What's the consequence of this? No, thank you. We don't think that it will be a colonizing in terms of like wiping out the territory and putting the people aside and replacing them with Indians, but it's only simply to the extent that some of the land can be shared and some of the land can become industries and some of the land can be tourist spots. Like the same thing that has happened with many countries. It was like Indonesia, with Bali, for Indonesia, Papua. No. Now, why do we think that it would be like a colonizing thing on their side of the house, right? First of all, let's talk about the Kashmiris' interest. We think that the Kashmiris' interest right now is still tackled, not only because of the characterizations that have been running around in the debate in which it's better than dying, but also we also think that Kashmiris in the status quo are already the most economically advantaged state in terms of India, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of, it means that they do lose out that much in terms of they do really necessarily need the economic control of Kashmir that much because they're already better off in comparison to other Indian states. But furthermore, in the condition where Article 230 is revoked, and we have better negotiations because we stop these fundings, because we might, as Pakistan and Kashmiris, for instance, opt to actually reduce these kinds of military operations, because negotiations would be easier. And the thing about better negotiations in the context of Article 230, which they have to respond, is that Kashmiris can still maintain their population measurement. Kashmiris can still maintain their houses. Kashmiris can even, in a lot of cases, have shared opportunities in terms of owning these industries, of owning these hotels, and so on. And also another thing that is important is that Kashmiri's culture can still be very further in this, even though they are not independent. In a tourist hub in which it is Kashmir, it would most probably be more strategic to also further Kashmiri identity in this case. So Islamic identity and Kashmiri identity in these particular places will still be strong because it's strategic in terms of tourism and international support and international popularity of Kashmir culture in general, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that Kashmiris retains cultural and economic benefits, and it can only happen when they negotiate without having the tarnished reputation of terrorist groups being backed up. We're extremely proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go on here from the French.
Yeah.
The separatist movements that will already exist, even in opening opposition, like in the opposition bench, are already labeled as terrorist anyway. I feel like this is a symmetrical benefit, which still like symmetrical outcome that still exists within the opening opposition side. But more importantly, this piece of analysis also takes out opening opposition. Because if you notice, what opening opposition want to talk about when it comes to trying to help the position of the Kashmiris currently is by having talks. But number one, they never analyze to you why the current separatist movements that already exist now would have any leverage over India to bring them into discussions at the end of the day. But number two, even if we take the best case scenario, right? Let's assume separatist groups don't exist within open opposition's world. They never told you why Kashmir currently have any leverage to even put India in the top in the absence of any loss by India. We say on that comparative, hence it means opening opposition literally never analyzed to you how the Kashmiri individuals will be better off within opening opposition's world. Closing opposition's analysis is symmetrical at best. I feel is a gov bench win. Got you, bro. So number one, I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Number one is I'm going to analyze the world. No, thank you. Analyze the world in which what happens after the support and the active funding and active support by Pakistan and China. And number two, I'll tell you why that at the end of the day will become a better alternative or better world than the comparative. Before that, right, I want to engage with one more thing, closing opposition. So closing opposition says that the land sharing thing that is happening within status quo, where the article is removed and now individuals who are non-Kashmiris can buy land and property and become residents within Kashmir is not bad because you're just sharing land. Number one, I don't think that's a good thing. The first of which is that if you notice, the BJP ran on a strong Hindu nationalist agenda, but number two, oftentimes the BJP politicians actively promote violence and oppression against Muslims, and when that happens, is an active silence from any calling out of those particular violence. We say the comparative is that you mobilize a lot of Hindu individuals to come into Kashmir. We say a lot of bad things are going to happen. In addition, right, if the analysis from Ade was true, that a Hindu in Kashmir is currently in a bad position, I see this is an easier political narrative to say that the Hindus in Kashmir have been oppressed by Muslim brothers in Kashmir right now. Your job or your duty now is to come help the Hindu individuals in Kashmir. I think more individuals are going to be screwed up in your side of the house at the end of the day. No, thank you. So first analysis, what happens when India and Pakistan actively support Kashmir separatist group? The first one I want to analyze is political separatist group, because I think this has very little analysis or response coming from closing opposition. First, when Pakistan or China can actively support, it's not just necessarily funding groups to attack, but when political separatist groups exist, it's things like, for example, active promotion of things like bringing them into international councils like the UNGA, for example, actively speaking in the UNGA. If you notice, the current situation now is that when a lot of information is silent, there is no ability for you to disseminate information that currently exists within status quo. Hence, in a world in which Pakistan actively supports the political separatists that currently exist, your ability to bring them to the international eyes oftentimes creates strong dissemination of information that would not have existed within opposition bench. Why is this good for the Kashmiris? Number one, we see this allows a strong legitimacy of the international community to create active pressure onto India. Things that, for example, sanctions, things that, for example, cutting ties, or things that, for example, political pressure by active condemnation. Oftentimes, these things have led to things that, for example, the constitutional changes that happened in 1979, when a lot of international pressure happened post the Civil War, creates a result of which is good. We say this in itself is already a good step towards dissemination of information that translates towards the protection of Kashmiri individuals at the end of the day. No, thank you. But what is the worst case, right? Let's analyze military separatists. I think like opening government say China and Pakistan are good, but like zero analysis as to why they are uniquely good. Let's look at the analysis it is I talked to you about. Number one, China granting being the second largest military, in addition to being the second biggest world weapons producer, in addition to things like, for example, past historical precedents, there's a lot of things like, for example, Bhutan and like Aksai Chin to be given to China as a result of their military might, means that on the balance of probability, your ability to get some level of intimidation in our best case, like in our worst case scenario, but number two, a concession by India in our best case scenario, oftentimes means that in this particular situation, active support by China translates to either a strong intimidation, which means that the Modi government is more likely going to come to the into the negotiating table. In addition, right, we say that the coupling with the international pressure created by the dissemination of information oftentimes still means your ability to do the referendum that it is I talked about is more likely to happen as a result. We say this. It creates a step towards either one of two things. Number one, a reversal of the 370 constitutional change, or number two, it creates secession towards Pakistan or even independence at the end of the day, sure.
So you admit post analysis, but the most reliable endgame is to have actual discussions. Tell me why funding separatist groups would assist in both parties of the conflict choosing diplomacy over sustained violence.
Well,
So you say you want international discussions as your final endgame. Tell me why funding separatist groups leads to that diplomatic outcome versus more sustained violence.
Oh, so number one is that the violence is, so number one is that it's not just violence, by the way. We told you political pressure oftentimes is created not violent. Given number two, intimidation without even shooting a bullet is still a strong incentive for them to go to the negotiating table. But number two, if you want to look at the balance of probability of both sides of the house, the ability for us to fund these separatist groups translate to that probability, as opposed to one where the separatist groups still exist in their side of the house but are underfunded as a result, and violence still exists in your world, but India will always have the ability to clamp down on that particular violence. India has less of an ability to clamp down on violence within outside the house because of strong military interventions at the end of the day. Next, let's analyze why at the end of the day this becomes a best interest for Kashmiris. No, thank you. Sure, before that.
So it's a bit hypocritical for you to support both the political separatists and the violent separatists, and because the international community will see that you're just causing more trouble rather than being the actor that can bring a diplomatic settlement.
I mean, the international community supported violence when South Sudan was trying to defend themselves from Omar Bashir. I think like the international community is particularly fine when they're trying to self-defend. There's no particular issue at the end of the day. Next, let's analyze when it comes to your ability to make Kashmiri individuals' lives better. Number one, in our worst case scenario, with a strong separatist group, politically, Kashmiris are able to at least have the ability to push for that negotiating discussion. The comparative is less in their side of the house, hence on that particular metric is better. Number two, your ability to defend yourself against groups, for example, the current military groups that exist, i.e. the Indian militaries that exist currently, being protected by ASPA when they are unable to be prosecuted for crime. I think closing government gets the analysis of self-defense because we are the only ones that are able to analyze how powerful the separatist group becomes at the end of the day in comparison to opening government. For all of those reasons, proud to propose.
Alright, thank you very much. Inviting the last speaker to make the omelet.
When the separatists that we are talking about is the like of Lashkar al-Taiba, who in 26 November 2008 did the Mumbai attack that killed 166 people and injured 300, who get so hated and unpopular both in India and in parts of Kashmir that they have to change their name to Kashmir Tehreek Azadi in early 2017, I think it is fair to doubt the people that the government bench are trusting to do this mission. I want to talk about three things. One, I want to talk about the battle. Can we win this war? And a direct comparison to our opening government and what the possible results are, how marginal it is, a direct comparison to CG. Secondly, I want to talk about life under Article 370. Why, while it's not perfect, it is a much better life compared to the life under an angry Indian coming to war. A direct comparison also to CG. And finally, comparing ourselves to our opening, why our contribution is much better. Let's begin with the battle itself. Let's first talk about the military battle before moving on to the political one. Because our contribution is that we characterize the separatists. We characterize Jail al-Mohammed. We characterize Harakat ul-Jihadi Islami. And what are these separatist strategies? Two things. A, guerrilla warfare. B, suicide bombing to create terrorist tactics, right? This will never be enough to win against the Indian military might, no matter how better armed they are. Why? Number one, because they are too small of a number. The Indian active military personnel have 3,200,000 soldiers, ladies and gentlemen. All the separatist groups combined does not even reach 8,000. It means that no matter how good your guerrilla warfare are, you will never be able to do enough to whittle the numbers of Indian soldiers at the end of the day. Secondly, weapons, because at best what you do to the military people is that you send weapons to the separatists, right? No matter how good, we still think that they will always be outgunned. India have more than 5,000 tanks and have higher than 500 amount of jets, right? Now, what will giving weapons to these separatists do, ladies and gentlemen? At best, what they get is some additional weapons. And what it will do is that it will only give the terrorists the courage to attack the Indian army. And that's bad. That's exactly what we want to prevent. Why? Two things. Number one, it gives India quickly send those 500 tanks and 600 jets. And secondly, it transformed the nature of war, because now they have more weapons. They will not only limit themselves to guerrilla warfare, but they will be doing a greater open warfare. They're not limiting themselves to suicide bomb. They're going to heavy war at the end of the day. The deaths and the casualties that happen from heavy war itself will be much bigger when attacks happen not only inside of mountains, but also inside of cities, ladies and gentlemen, which will be guarded by the Indian army. That's the deaths and casualty that increases in their side that they don't talk about. What are the marginal benefit claim? A, smuggling people. This is what opening said. Number one, access is limited. India have army in the border. It will be hard to smuggle that much people anyway. Secondly, what about the people who are left behind? Who will now be also persecuted by the Indian government, who will now be more oppressed and also seen as potential terrorists, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, a benefit of culture that is brought by the entire government bench. Number one, we think that there are still Kashmiri who prefer having their life not killed by a stray bullet. But secondly, understand that their culture right now is potentially associated with terrorist culture, ladies and gentlemen, the way Islam is associated with ISIS. In our world, at least they can still have the ability to practice their culture somewhat. In their world, they have a potential Uyghur scenario. All right, moving on to the political battle. No, look. CG comes up and they say that there are political parties who are pro-Kashmir that we can support at the end of the day. But here's the thing. When you combine with also the support that are being given to these militants that are considered as terrorists, what's going to happen in the political battle is that their ideology will now be seen as similar and the same with those of terrorists. And this is very dangerous because it prevents your ability to actually change. What is the comparative that we bring? Our comparative is an even angrier India, ladies and gentlemen, because now they will get more extreme. Not only are these terrorist groups existing, because we do consider that they exist, now they're being better funded. Now they're being supported. It gives the narrative that now they're being a much greater threat. What does this justify them to do? It justifies them to give and insert more destruction toward the area. And note that India will not back down. And they will not negotiate the way CG claims that they are going to be if we manage to wound them, right? No, because Modi is a strong man. That's his entire rhetoric, right? That he's the one that's able to protect India. Look what happened when a jet is struck down and a conflict happened within India and Pakistan over that jet. Modi doesn't back down. He utilizes it to strengthen his campaign. What they're doing is supporting this terrorist organization. This will only fuel the narrative that is necessary for him to do even greater military action that will result with more casualties at the end of the day. We don't think it's worth it. We think that our military contribution is therefore superior. Let's move on to life under Article 370. Why it's not perfect, it's a much better life. Yeah.
Kashmiris are already treated as terrorists, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
talks you talk about will happen better under our rule because of the pressure we put in India. But given that all of the benefits are probabilistic, what do you do against like the definitive benefits that we provide of smuggling people out and
Yeah.
actually saving the most vulnerable?
Yeah. There are profiling, definitely. But at least you are not seeing tanks suddenly being shot and destroying the entire city. You are not seeing all more than 300 missiles being shot instead of Kashmiri cities. These are the potentials that can easily increase the moment you see more and more funding, because now you think that if you are not overpowering it in terms of weapons, you are not going to win. That's the rest of escalating the war, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what they have. A military escalation that justifies greater destruction, because now, in order for India to no longer be paranoid and to be secure, they must do it, right? Let's move to life under Article 370, because the only response that we hear is that the BJP are anti-Muslim. Fair enough, we agree. But two things. One, there are challengers like the likes of Nehru Gandhi. At least right now, if they were to win, at least they can help. But the comparative is right now, Kashmir is brushed under the same terroristic lens. Now, their support that can come will be significantly less. But secondly, understand that Hindus are already existing inside of Kashmir. There are non-Muslim inside of Kashmir. So the kind of discrimination that become tipping point should not be social discrimination, ladies and gentlemen, because the kind of social discrimination already happened because there are already non-Muslim within the Kashmiri demographic. So demographic change is not the key tipping point in this debate. However, what is a key tipping point under Article 370 is the ability to buy land. And this is our very important contribution. Because of the ability to buy land, because this is utilized by India for business purpose to counter that economic woes, ladies and gentlemen, it means that for hotels and for factories to exist, at least Kashmir must be relatively safe, all right? You are not going to have tourists coming in if terrorists are bombing and everything. You are not going to have a good supply chain if the factors are continuously targeted at the end of the day. That's why there is at least going to be an attempt for relative peace. But all that will be gone if you have more and more terrorists getting courage by having more weapons at the end of the day. You are only risking that. At least in our side, this business interest is enough for India to hold its destruction back and rein it in. That's not going to happen when you are seeing a much greater national threat in their side on the terrorists that are supported by Pakistan and China. Compared to why are we better? Because number one, we analyze who these separatists are, we classify who is it, why they cannot win. Secondly, because we analyze life under Article 370, why it's at least a much better life. We proudly oppose.
Thank you, debaters, for a great debate. Please hold the floor, shake hands. Also, everybody.